They say the cold preserves things. It keeps bodies from rotting, memories from fading. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, the cold doesn't preserve. It swallows. I live alone in a cabin buried deep in the Alaskan wilderness. The nearest town is over 50 miles away, and the closest neighbor, if you could call a seasonal trapper a neighbor, is a good day's hike through thick snow and frozen pines. Out here, the world moves slow. The wind howls through the valley, pressing against my windows like a restless ghost. The nights stretch long, endless, like the dark sky itself is trying to pull me under. And I like it that way. At least I used to. My name is Bale Carter. I'm a wildlife photographer, or at least that's what I tell people. The truth is, I came out here to disappear, to leave behind the noise, the people, the weight of expectations. The silence of the wilderness is a comfort, a place where I can be alone with my thoughts without the city breathing down my neck. My cabin is small, one room, a wood-burning stove, a cot in the corner, and a workbench covered in scattered notes and camera equipment. The walls are lined with shelves of books, most of them well-worn from too many readings on nights when sleep wouldn't come. A radio sits on the table, crackling every now and then with updates from Ranger Davis, the only person who still checks in on me from time to time. The days pass in quiet routine. I wake before sunrise, brew a cup of bitter coffee, and step outside to take in the morning air. The sky is a pale shade of blue, the snow untouched except for the tracks of passing wildlife. Sometimes I catch a glimpse of a fox darting between the trees, or the heavy footprints of a moose that wandered too close in the night. But lately, I've been noticing something else. Something I can't explain. It started with small things. My cabin door, which I always keep latched, was slightly ajar one morning. I blamed the wind. Then, a tin of food for my supplies went missing. I figure I miscounted. But then there were the footprints. Not animal tracks. Not the deep, deliberate steps of a hunter or hiker. These were different, long, uneven strides leading up to my window, and no tracks leading away. I told myself it was just a trick of the snow, that maybe the wind had erased the rest. I even laughed about it, shaking my head as I stepped back inside and bolted the door. But that night, as I lay in bed listening to the fire crackle, I heard something outside, a faint crunching in the snow. Slow, measured. Someone was out there, standing in the darkness, watching. I woke up to silence, that heavy kind of silence that doesn't just sit in the room, but presses against your chest. Out here in the middle of nowhere, you get used to quiet, but this was different. It felt unnatural, like the world outside was holding its breath. I pushed off my blanket and sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes. The fire had died down, leaving only faint red embers glowing in the dark. The air inside the cabin was cold. Too cold. I could see my breath when I exhaled. That's when I noticed the door. It was still shut, locked, just like I had left it. But something felt off. The cabin wasn't big, just one main room with a small kitchen and a bathroom tucked in the corner. I could see everything from my bed, and yet, I had the strongest feeling that something had been here. I shook it off, got up, and grabbed my coat. Stepping outside, the cold hit me like a slap. The wind had died down, and the trees stood still, their branches heavy with fresh snow. And then I saw them. Footprints. A trail of them, starting from the tree line and leading straight to my window. My stomach twisted. The prints were deep, the shape unmistakably human. Someone had been standing there, right outside, just inches from where I had been sleeping, watching. I took a slow step forward, my boots crunching in the snow. The trail was clear. Whoever it was had walked up to my window and stopped. But there were no prints leading away. Just a single set, coming but not going. I swallowed hard. Maybe the wind had covered the rest, or maybe I was still half asleep, my mind playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. I scanned the tree line, my heart hammering against my ribs. The forest was thick, dark even in daylight, shadows shifting between the trunks. I squinted, half expecting to see movement. A figure. Something. Nothing. I forced myself to breathe. It had to be a hunter, a lost traveler, someone looking for shelter. That made sense, didn't it? And yet, why hadn't they knocked? Why just stand there? I backed away slowly and reached for the door, my fingers stiff from the cold. Inside, I locked it, deadbolt and all. Then, just for good measure, I pushed a chair against it. The fire needed tending, but I didn't move from my spot for a long time. Instead, I just stood there, staring at the window. Outside, the footprints waited. The wind outside had been howling all evening, rattling against the cabin walls like a living thing. I sat by the wood stove, cradling a mug of coffee, watching the fire dance in the dim light. The world outside was buried in snow, endless and quiet, stretching far beyond what the eye could see. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, pressing in like a weight on my chest. I glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. The nights in Alaska were long this time of year, the kind of darkness that felt like it would never lift. The storm had settled a few hours ago, leaving the forest eerily still. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of the fire seep into my bones. Then, something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was a trick of the firelight, just the shadows shifting outside the window. But no, there at the edge of the tree line stood a figure. My breath hitched. The man was tall, too tall. He stood perfectly still, his arms hanging loosely at his sides. The snow around him was untouched, like he had just materialized there. My cabin was at least 15 miles from the nearest town. No one wandered out this far. I sat frozen, staring at him, waiting for him to move. He didn't. Slowly, I set my coffee down and reached for the rifle propped against the wall. My fingers curled around the cold metal, but I didn't lift it yet. I squinted, trying to make out details in the dim light. His face was impossible to see, swallowed by the shadows of the trees. I swallowed hard. Hey! My voice sounded strange in the silence, too loud in the stillness of the cabin. No response, no flinch, no shift in posture. The fire crackled beside me, but I barely noticed it now. My heart was pounding. The way he stood there, it wasn't normal. People didn't just watch like that. I blinked, and he was gone. A cold rush of air filled my lungs as I shot to my feet, rifle raised. My pulse roared in my ears as I scanned the tree line. There was nothing, just the dark outlines of pines and the thick carpet of untouched snow. I hesitated for a long moment before moving toward the door. My boots thudded against the wooden floor as I unbolted the latch and stepped onto the porch. The cold slapped me in the face, biting through my flannel shirt. I peered into the trees, gripping the rifle tight. The wind had picked up again, whispering through the branches. No footprints, no movement, nothing. But I knew what I saw. I stood there for a long time, rifle raised, breath forming small clouds in the frozen air. After a few minutes, I backed up toward the door, never turning my back to the woods. When I was inside, I locked the door twice. Then, just as I reached for my coffee, I noticed something else. My coffee was still steaming. The fire was still crackling. I had only looked away for a second, and yet his footprints should have still been there. I woke up to a sound. At first, I thought it was the wind. Out here, the wind never truly stops. It howls, whispers, and sometimes even screams. But this wasn't the wind. It was something closer, something real, a slow, deliberate scraping against the wood. I held my breath, heart pounding in my ears. The sound came from outside, just below my bedroom window. It was steady, rhythmic, like nails dragging across the cabin's outer walls. Scratch, pause, scratch, pause. I reached for the rifle beside my bed, gripping it tightly as I listened. I wanted to believe it was an animal. Maybe a bear passing through. Maybe a tree branch brushing against the wood. But deep down, I knew better. I lay there, frozen, waiting for it to stop. Then, suddenly, silence. For a long moment, I didn't move. The only sound was my breathing, slow and uneven. I told myself it was over. Maybe it had just been my imagination. But then came a worse part. A whisper. Faint. Almost too quiet to hear. Bale. The sound sent ice down my spine. My name. Someone had whispered my name. I leapt out of bed, throwing on my coat and boots. With the rifle clutched in both hands, I swung the door open and stepped onto the porch. The air was sharp and freezing, but I barely noticed. My breath came in fast clouds, my grip tightening around the gun. The snow was untouched. No footprints. No tracks of any kind. I circled the cabin, scanning the darkness, but there was no sign of movement. No figure in the woods. Just the trees standing still under the moonlight, their long shadows stretching across the snow. Then I saw them. The scratches. Long, Deep grooves etched in the wood beneath my window. Not from an animal. Not from tree branches swaying in the wind. These were deliberate, precise, carved with something sharp. There were 4 long marks, each one dragging downward like fingers raking against the cabin. I swallowed hard. Someone had been standing there, just inches from where I slept. I stepped back, scanning the tree line, rifle raised. My pulse was a drumbeat in my skull. But the woods remained silent. Empty. I should have left that night. I should have packed my things, gotten in my truck, and driven until I saw another human face. But instead, I turned around, locked the door, and convinced myself it would be fine. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself it wouldn't happen again. I was wrong. I woke up with a start. The cabin was silent, but something felt off. My heart was pounding in my chest, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe a bad dream? I tried to remember, but all I could grasp was the lingering feeling of being watched. The fire in the wood stove had burned low, casting weak, flickering shadows across the room. The only other source of light was the moon, its pale glow filtering through the frost-covered window. I pulled the blanket tighter around me and glanced at the clock on the wall. 3:12 a.m. Then I heard it. A sound so faint I almost convinced myself I imagined it. A light tap, tap, tap against the glass. A part of me hesitated, refusing to turn my head. My body tensed, my breath caught in my throat. I was fully awake now, senses alert, every nerve screaming at me to stay still. The sound came again, more insistent this time. Tap, tap, tap. Slowly, I turned toward the window, and my blood turned to ice. A face, pressed against the glass. The breath left my lungs in a sharp gasp. The figure was too close, its skin sickly pale under the moonlight. The eyes, wide, unblinking, reflecting the dim light in an unnatural way. The mouth curled into a grin, stretching too far, too wrong. Teeth uneven, jagged. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I could only stare, frozen in place, as the thing outside stared right back at me. Its breath fogged up a small patch of the glass, but it didn't blink, didn't move, just stood there, watching. The longer I looked, the more I realized something was wrong about it. The proportions weren't right. The shoulders slumped at an odd angle. The neck tilted as if the bones inside were twisted. Then it moved. The head jerked slightly to the side, like a broken puppet adjusting its position. My stomach twisted in terror. I shot up from my bed. Reaching for the rifle, I kept leaning against the nightstand. My fingers fumbled over the cold metal, struggling to find a grip. When I looked back at the window, it was gone. The snow outside was undisturbed. No footprints. No sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I saw. I rushed to the door, heart hammering, and threw it open, stepping onto the porch. The wind howled through the trees, carrying a biting chill, but the night was empty. The silence was almost suffocating. I took a slow, shaky breath, scanning the tree line, looking for any movement. Nothing. Just endless white and the towering dark pines. I gripped the rifle tighter and backed into the cabin, locking the door behind me. For the rest of the night, I sat awake in my chair, the rifle across my lap, eyes locked on the window. I didn't sleep, and I knew, deep in my bones, that whatever was out there wasn't done watching me. I spent hours that day, setting up the cameras around the cabin. I didn't even know why I bothered, but something in me needed to prove that I wasn't imagining all of this. The strange things, the feeling of being watched, the footprints, those damn footprints that led up to my window, but then disappeared. It was all too real, and yet too bizarre to wrap my mind around. The cameras were simple enough. I'd used them before on wildlife shoots, to catch the perfect shot of a moose or a bear. Tonight, I was hoping to catch something much less innocent. I set them up around the perimeter of the cabin, pointed toward the trees and the thick line of snow that separated me from the wilderness. I even set up one by my window, hoping it might catch a glimpse of that pale, twisted face, the one I'd seen last night, grinning at me from the other side of the glass. I returned inside as dusk began to fall, my fingers stiff with the cold as I locked the door. There was no fire going, too late to start one, and the air was biting. I sat in the silence for a while, staring out the window, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The wind howled outside, but that was normal. There was nothing normal about the feeling that gnawed at the back of my neck, though. It was like something was lurking just beyond the glass, waiting for me to blink. Around midnight, I went to check the cameras. I told myself it was just routine, but deep down, I knew I was hoping for a glimpse of something that would confirm I wasn't losing my mind. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out into the night, my boots crunching through the snow. The cold bit into my skin, and I could feel my breath fogging in the air as I moved between the trees, checking each camera one by one. The first few were fine. Nothing unusual. Just the trees, the shadows, and the snow. But when I reached the camera near my window, something felt off. It wasn't just the cold, or the way the night pressed in around me. It was a feeling, a knot in my stomach that made every hair on my body stand on end. I pulled up the footage, feeling a small shiver run through me as I waited for it to load. The screen flickered for a second, then settled. I saw the same thing I always did when I checked these cameras, just the snow, the wind, the trees. But then, I saw something move in the corner of the frame. At first, I thought it was a shadow, or maybe the camera was glitching. But no, this was different. It was too smooth, too deliberate. I leaned closer to the screen, my breath shallow. In the footage, a figure crawled across the snow. Slowly at first, but then with unnerving speed. It wasn't a man, not in the way any man should move. The figure moved like an animal, its limbs too long, too jointed in ways they shouldn't be. Its body twisted in impossible ways, jerking and bending like something that wasn't meant to be. I pressed pause. My hand shook as I reached for the mouse, but I couldn't look away. The figure's head was tilted back unnaturally, its face hidden in shadow, but I knew it was the same twisted thing. The one that had been watching me. The one whose face had been pressed against my window. The hairs on the back of my neck stood at attention, and the cabin suddenly felt smaller, colder. I couldn't breathe for a moment. All of my thoughts jammed together, crashing into one another. Was this real? Had I really seen it? Or was it some sort of trick my mind was playing on me? Maybe I was losing it. Maybe I'd been alone for too long. But then, the footage flickered again. A face appeared, out of nowhere, in the top right corner of the frame. It wasn't there a second ago. The camera was on a timer, and the figure hadn't been in that spot. This face was pressed against the lens. A pale, contorted face, its eyes wide and unblinking, its skin stretched too tight. The twisted man. Icardi. I slammed the laptop shut, my heart racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know if I was supposed to laugh or scream. I was no longer sure if I was in danger, or if I was simply losing my grip on reality. But the terror didn't stop there. As I sat frozen in the dark, my flashlight flickered and went out. The cabin was silent, too silent, and it hit me all at once. He's still out there. I grabbed my rifle, even though I didn't know what good it would do. He was here, or at least something was. My mind was a whirl of questions, none of them making sense, but one thing was clear. Whatever I had seen, it was not human, and it was getting closer. The storm outside was relentless. The wind howled, rattling the windows, and the snow piled up so thick that the cabin seemed to sink deeper into the earth with every passing hour. I had learned to live with the cold, the quiet, and the isolation, but tonight felt different. The house felt heavier somehow, as if something was pressing against the walls, waiting to slip inside. I had double-checked everything before bed, locked all the doors, pulled the shades tight. I had even checked the windows once more, half expecting to see him again, the twisted man. I had seen him so many times now that his image was burned in my mind, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was imagining it all. The snow, the isolation, it was enough to mess with anyone's mind. Or at least, that's what I kept telling myself. But tonight, something was wrong. I woke up to the sound of the wind crashing against the cabin, howling louder than ever. I tried to roll over and sleep through it, but my eyes kept fluttering open, half-conscious. Something was off. My instincts were buzzing, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something wasn't right. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the storm. It was the silence. The wind outside, so fierce just moments ago, had fallen still. A thick, suffocating silence hung in the air. Even the fire crackling in the hearth seemed muted. I couldn't hear the usual creaks of the house settling or the occasional rattle of the cabin's old foundation. Just an eerie, dead quiet. I lay still for a moment, listening, but there was nothing, only the oppressive quiet. Then came the sound that made my blood run cold. A soft creak, followed by a slow, deliberate scrape. The door. I couldn't move at first. My heart began to pound, and my mind spun in circles, trying to make sense of it. I had locked it. I had made sure of that. Twice. There was no way it could have just opened on its own. I forced myself out of bed, my legs unsteady as I stood. I reached for the rifle I kept by the nightstand, fingers trembling but determined. Every part of me screamed to run, to leave this place, but I couldn't. Not again. I had to face whatever this was. I had to make it stop. I moved toward the door, my breath shallow, the silence around me suffocating. My hand rested on the doorknob, and with a deep breath, I slowly turned it. The door was unlocked. I opened it just a crack, my heart thudding in my chest, and there it was. The cold night air rushed in like a wave, but there was something else, something worse. The door had been open. I stepped into the darkened hallway, my rifle raised. The house was quiet, too quiet. My own footsteps seemed louder than they should have been, echoing off the walls. I glanced back over my shoulder, expecting to see shadows flickering in the corners, but there was nothing. No figure lurking in the hallway. But the feeling didn't go away. That presence. That awful, gnawing sense that something was here, that someone was watching me. I checked each room. Empty. The kitchen, the living room, even the bathroom, all the same. The house was still. I don't know what compelled me to check the back door, but I did. I stepped over the threshold of the kitchen, my footsteps heavier now, and moved toward the back of the house. And then I froze. The back door, the one I had triple-checked earlier, was open, wide open, like it had been pulled open by invisible hands. I felt my throat tighten. My rifle felt useless in my grip. My pulse raced. How could this be happening? How had the door opened? There was only one way to find out. I took a slow, steadying breath and stepped into the bitter cold. The snow crunched under my boots as I stood on the porch, staring out into the blinding white landscape. The wind had picked up again, but the silence around me felt unnatural. A stillness that was deeper than the storm, darker than the night. I turned back toward the cabin. The door was open, hanging there, an invitation to whatever nightmare was waiting inside. And then, in the dim glow of the porch light, I saw something that made my stomach twist. A set of footprints in the snow. They were fresh. The snow had fallen heavy, but these prints were clear, each step leaving an indentation in the soft powder. They led right up to the door. But the strangest thing was, there were only two sets of prints. Mine and something else. The prints were too small to be human. Too erratic. Too wrong. Like they had been dragged along the snow, dragged by something that didn't walk the way we did. I felt my breath catch in my throat as I stared at the trail, my eyes locked on the eerie marks. The storm held around me, but in that moment, the world felt utterly still. And then, from the corner of my eye, I saw him. Standing in the dark, just beyond the tree line, barely visible in the shadows, the twisted man was there. His face, pale, distorted, pressed against the glass of my window, watching. I didn't think. I didn't hesitate. I turned and bolted back inside, slamming the door behind me. The house felt even colder now, the air thick with dread. My hands shook as I grabbed my rifle, every nerve in my body screaming at me to do something. Anything. But the worst part was the faint sound of laughter on the wind. Laughter that didn't belong to any human. And I knew, deep down, that it was only the beginning. I woke to the sound of the door creaking, a groan that echoed through the silence of the cabin. For a moment, I thought it was the wind, pushing against the walls, rattling the old wood. But then I realized, the wind doesn't open doors. My heart slammed against my ribs, loud and fast, as if it knew before I did. I lay still, staring into the dark, listening to the soft, rhythmic sound of my own breathing. There was no mistake. The door wasn't just creaking, it was opening. I didn't move at first. Fear and confusion twisted together in my gut. Had I forgotten to lock it? Was it some wild animal, a bear maybe, trying to get in? But then I remembered, the door was locked. I had double-checked it before bed. It had been secure. I reached for the rifle beside my bed, fingers trembling, trying to ignore the creeping panic that was slowly crawling up my spine. I couldn't hear anything now. No wind, no animals, just the deep, unsettling silence that wrapped the cabin like a thick, suffocating blanket. I pulled myself out of bed as quietly as I could, my feet making almost no sound on the cold wooden floor. I didn't want to make a noise. I didn't want to alert whatever was out there that I was awake. The door was open just a crack, barely wide enough for a person to slip through. The shadow of the hallway stretched long and dark in front of me, and I swallowed hard, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to spring into action. The rifle felt cold in my hands, heavy with purpose. I stepped forward, my footsteps slow, deliberate. There was something wrong about the way the air felt, thick with dread and tension, like it was holding its breath. I crept down the hallway, keeping my back to the wall, eyes darting between the dim light of the moon filtering through the windows and the thick shadows where something could be lurking. Every little creak of the floorboards beneath my feet felt like a shout in the silence. And then I heard it, a soft shuffle, barely there, like something dragging its feet across the floor. My stomach dropped. I wasn't alone. I tightened my grip on the rifle and turned the corner. For a split second, I saw nothing. The hallway stretched in front of me, dimly lit by the moonlight, empty. But my instinct screamed, telling me I wasn't alone. I stepped forward cautiously, the rifle raised just enough to defend myself, but steady in my hands. And then I saw it. Accardi. He was standing in the far corner of the living room, his back to me, staring at the window, as though waiting for something. His silhouette was unnaturally still, like he was part of the shadows. His hair hung down over his face, so I couldn't see his eyes, but I didn't need to. I could feel him. The thing about Accardi wasn't just his appearance. It wasn't even the way he moved, or how his body seemed twisted, like it was bent in ways that weren't human. It was the way he felt, like something out of place. A force, a presence, that didn't belong here, didn't belong in my world. I don't know what possessed me to speak, but I did. Who are you? The words came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. He didn't turn around. His silence was more terrifying than anything he could have said. I took a step forward, the rifle still aimed at him. And then, almost too fast for my eyes to follow, he spun around. His head jerked at an impossible angle, his neck cracking loudly. "Don't look at me," he rasped, the words coming out too smooth, too wrong. Before I could react, before I could even comprehend what was happening, he lunged forward. I fired. The bullet tore through the air, but it didn't seem to hit him. It went wide, missing him entirely. Accardi's body didn't flinch, didn't even seem to acknowledge the shot. I backed up, panic rising in my chest, the rifle trembling in my hands. "No," I whispered. "No, no, no." But Accardi didn't stop. He was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. One moment, he was standing there, and the next, he was at the door, his long, bony fingers scraping across the wood. I didn't even have time to think. I just ran. I dropped the rifle as I bolted for the door. I didn't care about anything but getting out. The door slammed open with a force that sent splinters flying. I didn't stop to check if Accardi was behind me. I couldn't. I only ran, straight into the night, straight into the snowstorm. The wind howled, biting at my skin, but I didn't feel it. The only thing I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat, pounding in my ears. The only thing I could think about was getting away from him. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, heading toward the old ranger station I knew was a few miles away. I could make it. I had to make it. But then, just as I thought I was safe, I heard it. The laughter, low and chilling, coming from the trees. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't feel my fingers anymore. The cold had seeped into my bones, a slow, unforgiving creep that left me numb and disoriented. I stumbled through the snowdrifts, my breath a cloud of vapor in the frigid air, my rifle clutched tight in my gloved hands. I had no plan, just an instinctual drive to get away, to find somewhere safe. The ranger station was my only hope, just a few miles from my cabin, but the storm was picking up, turning the world into a blur of white. The old wooden building finally came into view, barely visible through the snow. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, shrouded in ice, with the windows dark, as if abandoned forever. My heart beat harder, not just from the cold, but from a gnawing sense of dread. I wanted to believe I was safe. I needed to believe it. But with every step closer, the air felt heavier, thicker. The door to the station was cracked open, as if waiting for me. I hesitated. The last time I'd come here, The station was operational. Rangers used it as a base when checking on the surrounding wilderness. But now, the door hung like a forgotten memory, creaking in the wind. I forced myself forward, each step a battle against the storm and against the terror growing inside me. I stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me. The smell of mildew and dust hit me like a wall. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the moon through the dirty windows. It was cold inside, the warmth of the storm outside far more inviting than the chill within. I scanned the room. Everything was in disarray, papers scattered across the floor, a table overturned, cabinets ajar. The place had been ransacked, or maybe just abandoned in a hurry. But I couldn't help but feel that something more sinister had happened here. I stepped further inside, my boots crunching on the glass shards beneath me. I moved to the desk in the corner, dusting off a chair before sitting down. The creaky wood groaned beneath me. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something in the back of my mind told me this station held answers. Answers I didn't want but desperately needed. There were files, old and yellowed with age, piled haphazardly. I flipped through them slowly, the names and dates unfamiliar. Names of rangers who had worked these parts years ago. But one file caught my eye, buried beneath the rest. Its cover was worn, torn at the edges. The name on it sent a chill straight through me. Icardi. I hesitated, fingers hovering over the file. I knew that name. The twisted man from my window, the one who had been watching me. Icardi. I opened the file, my hands shaking. Inside, there were handwritten notes, many of them illegible, some faded, but enough to make my blood run cold. There were mentions of sightings, strange figures in the woods, a man who had disappeared years ago, but whose presence still haunted the area, a man who had never truly left the wilderness. The last entry, dated many years ago, was the most chilling. He watches first, then he takes you. I read it again. My breath caught in my throat. My eyes darted around the room, as though expecting Icardi to appear at any moment. But the room was silent. Too silent. The floor creaked behind me. I froze. Every hair on my body stood on end as I slowly turned my head toward the sound. My breath quickened. My pulse raced. There, in the doorway, stood a figure. Pale, unnaturally still, just like the one I had seen in my window. Icardi. His twisted grin was the first thing I noticed. The same grin from the window, stretched far too wide. His eyes gleamed in the dim light, reflecting the moon as if they didn't belong in this world. His skin was too white, too stretched, and his body, it didn't look right. He stood there, silent, watching me, not moving, but somehow getting closer. I scrambled to my feet, knocking over the chair. My heart pounded in my chest, thudding in my ears. I grabbed my rifle, but my hands were so cold and numb I could barely hold it steady. Icardi stepped forward, his movement fluid, unnatural. It was as if he were gliding across the floor, not walking at all. Leave, I rasped, my voice barely a whisper, but the words came out more like a plea than a command. His smile widened, and he tilted his head to one side, as if amused by my fear. But there was something else, something deeper in his gaze, something older, colder, as if he had been waiting here for far longer than I could ever understand. I tried to back away, but my legs felt frozen to the floor. You shouldn't have come here. His voice was a rasp, barely audible, but it felt like it was echoing inside my skull. Now you're mine. I didn't think. I ran. I bolted for the door, not even stopping to grab my coat. I didn't need to look back to know he was following. The air was thick, too thick to breathe, and every step felt like I was wading through water. The storm outside howled like a beast, but I could still hear him. His footsteps, silent but relentless. Closer, closer. I made it outside, gasping for breath, but there was no escape. The storm swallowed me whole. The wind howled louder as the door to the ranger station creaked open, sending a rush of cold air into the dimly lit room. I didn't even need to turn around to know what was standing there. The smell of wet earth, of something decaying, filled my nostrils. My body went stiff. I froze. I had heard the footsteps in the hallway. Soft, deliberate steps. He was inside. I had thought I'd escape, that the ranger station would be a refuge, a place where I could hold out until morning, or at least until something, anything, changed. But there was no refuge here. The walls felt like they were closing in, the shadows stretching unnaturally in the flickering light of the oil lamp I had barely been able to keep burning. The air felt thick, as if it was being sucked away, leaving me gasping for breath. I slowly turned to face him, though I had no intention of standing still and waiting for him to finish me off. I'd had enough of being hunted. The door opened wider. Icardi was standing there, his face like a pale mask. I couldn't see his eyes. They were hidden beneath the dark, matted hair that fell over his brow. But I could feel them on me, weighing me down. He didn't move. He never moved like a normal person would. He was more like a shadow that had come to life, a creature from the depths of the snow and cold. The cold that filled the room with an icy bite was nothing compared to the chill that ran down my spine as he took a step forward. My hand gripped the rifle. My fingers were numb from the cold, but the weight of the gun felt steady in my grasp. I could still hear the whispering wind outside, but all that mattered was the man, or whatever he was, standing before me. "Leave me alone," I managed to say, my voice barely more than a rasp. The creature didn't respond. It never spoke. It never needed to. I raised the rifle, heart pounding, but as I pulled the trigger, the shot didn't even echo in the air. Icardi didn't flinch. He didn't even seem to care that I had fired at him. I watched as he simply stepped forward, and I realized with a sinking feeling that the bullet hadn't even grazed him. It had gone straight through him, as if he weren't real at all. A low laugh bubbled up from his throat. It was wrong. It didn't belong in the world. Before I could raise the rifle again, he was upon me. He was fast, too fast. His hand wrapped around my throat, cold as ice, and I couldn't breathe. Panic surged through me, my hands clawing at his wrist, but his grip only tightened. His fingers felt like steel, pressing down harder and harder until I couldn't feel my pulse anymore. My vision blurred. I struggled, thrashing against him, but nothing made him loosen his grip. His breath came in slow, even gasps, almost like he was savoring the moment. I couldn't let this happen. I couldn't end here, not like this, not in a place where no one would ever know what happened to me. I looked around. My eyes darted across the dimly lit room, the shadows seeming to swirl around the edges. Then I saw it. The ranger's old radio, sitting on the dusty counter, barely working. I had used it to contact Davis earlier, but now it seemed like the only hope I had left. With every ounce of strength I had, I pulled my arm up and reached toward the radio. My fingers brushed against it, the cold metal sending a shiver through my body. I grabbed it with all the force I could muster, slammed it against Icardi's skull. It worked. For a moment, his grip loosened as he recoiled back, dazed. I gasped for air, my throat raw. My fingers felt like they were made of stone, but I didn't hesitate. I raised the rifle again, took aim, and fired. This time, it was a clean shot, straight to his chest. Icardi didn't fall. He didn't even blink. The bullet had no effect on him, not even a trace. The air grew colder. It felt like time itself had stopped. "You can't escape," he said, his voice so cold, so hollow, that it felt like it came from the ground itself. My blood ran cold. I turned and ran, bolting through the door and into the storm, not thinking about where I was going. I just ran as fast as I could, through the heavy snow, the wind biting at my skin. I could hear him behind me, moving in ways no human should. The storm was blinding, the snow thickening with every step I took. I stumbled, falling to my knees, but I kept moving. The ranger station was fading behind me, its silhouette disappearing in the white haze. But as I ran, I felt something in the air, something pressing down on me. It was a weight I couldn't escape. And then I heard it, the laugh. It wasn't just behind me. It was all around me, in the wind, in the trees, in my mind. I stopped. I didn't know if I could make it to safety. I didn't know if anyone would ever find me. I didn't know if I would make it through the night. And maybe that's the point. Icardi was never just a man. He wasn't something I could shoot. He wasn't something I could run from. In the end, I was never meant to leave. I glanced back into the swirling snow, and that's when I realized he had never left either.